Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 102. This will be the Chapter 6 audio lecture, and tonight we're going to talk about specialized roles of the police. And in your textbook, you can take your own time to kind of do this, but on page 196, there are some definitions in there, and I think I've said this in a couple other chapters that it would be a great idea that you look through the list of definitions so you kind of have a better understanding on not only what the words mean, but how they fit into tonight's lecture and some of the lectures later on down the line. So chapter 6 begins with a brief discussion of the pros and cons of specialization, because there are some good things and bad things about it. It then looks at what is often considered the most glamorous aspect of policing, like detectives or crime scene investigator, forensics, and things like that. The next specialized functions we'll kind of take a look at might be intelligence officers. We'll look at vice officers and narcotics and SWAT and canines, and a couple of those kind of high profile specialized units that you tend to maybe hear about more or see a little bit more about on television. So in addition to the general function of patrol, including traffic, and we talked about that a little bit last week, a number of specialized functions are also required of law enforcement personnel, and sometimes all of the functions are performed by a single person, which can be a little bit challenging. In a larger department, however, separate divisions may exist for each specialized function. Some patrol officers receive special training to deal with specific problems like hostage negotiator or snipers or VIP protection, riot or crowd control, rescue operations, and control of what they call suppressible crimes, and I'll define that in a minute. So basically what the introduction is kind of telling us is that, hey, besides patrol, organizations, and you saw this in the organizational chart a couple chapters ago, have specialized units or groups of individuals that maybe do certain things, like a canine unit. It might be 3, 4, 5 canine handlers that work in that particular unit. Narcotics officers working in a group together to deal with narcotics enforcement. Gang officers the same way, or the more highly publicized SWAT officers that get called out to deal with certain situations that the average patrol officer can't handle because of experience, training, and the amount of resources that they might need to deal with something. So when we kind of go back a little bit and we define that word suppressible crime that I spoke of just a second ago, suppressible crimes are crimes that commonly occur in locations and under certain circumstances that give police officers a reasonable opportunity to deter or apprehend offenders. Included among such suppressible crimes are things like robbery, burglary, car theft, assault, and sex crimes. Such problems often involve a need for covert surveillance, decoys, tactics, and things that uniformed patrol officers can't do. So, I mean, if you have a series of burglaries going on, patrol officers can't really surveil burglars for long periods of time, or suspected burglars, because they have patrol beats and other functions and calls and things they have to handle. So a specialized unit may need to step in that don't have to respond to calls for service, in essence, and kind of handle that. So that's what they kind of categorize as suppressible crimes. So when we get into this chapter a little bit more, in large departments, we will see separate divisions that are going to exist for each specialized function. Like I said, like SWAT or gangs or something similar. Some patrol officers receive specialized training to deal with specific problems. So there are some trained officers that are out there that can handle certain things up to a certain limit. An example would be, and especially in small departments, your patrol officer may also be a SWAT officer. So while they're working patrol, if a SWAT thing goes down, then they're removed from the patrol division, put back into their SWAT realm, and they work with the SWAT folks to handle whatever it is. So depending upon the size of the organization, you may have some people that are specialized in a few different things. Specialized operations are often used to saturate particular areas, meaning handle specific problems. And finally, countermeasures to combat street crimes have included things like stings, police decoys to catch criminals. And this is, again, if we had more time, we could spend on it, and we might. There's a very gray area in there when you're talking about setting up stings, because some people think that you're basically setting people up, you're entrapping them to commit certain crimes, and that's really not true. Here's an example of a sting that we did in Rialto, and we're not going to sit here and debate the issue, but we can talk a little bit more later. So we have a rash of, let's say, thefts from vehicles. So people are breaking windows and taking things out of cars. So auto burglaries. So in order to help out, what we might do is we'll get a group of officers that are going to set up a surveillance and a sting operation that night. They will take, say, a brand new laptop computer, put a tracker chip in it, stick it on the front seat of a car, put it in a vehicle, lock it up, and park it in a high crime neighborhood where these thefts are taking place. These burglaries are happening. And at some point while they're surveilling the car, somebody might break the window, take the laptop, which will trigger the tracking mechanism, and we can basically track the person on a computer via GPS all the way back to their house and arrest them. Now, some people say, hey, you know what, that's not fair. You set me up. Okay, but nobody really did tell you to break the window of a car and take something that didn't belong to you. So that's the counter argument. But that's one idea of kind of a sting operation in order to deal with some of these targeted things that we're talking about. So the advantage and disadvantage of specialization. So the downside of, well, let's start with the positive. The positive aspects of specialization really are attention is narrowly focused, meaning that you're only dealing with like one thing. So if you're working narcs, you're working narcs. You're working gangs, you're working gangs. Now, sometimes they overlap a little bit, but for the most part, you're not dealing with calls for service and all the other kinds of things. The officers develop a certain amount of expertise. Well, sure, if you're working detectives, gangs, children crimes, things like that, you're going to start to develop a high level of expertise as you continue to work these assignments. So that's a good thing. Efficiency is improved, meaning that, sure, as you're out there targeting auto thieves, burglars, robbers, or whatever, what you do, you get better at it, and your overall efficiency for making arrests and clearing cases, those things go up. So that's a good thing. Officers become very effective in accomplishing their mission, meaning that they have a plan that they formulate to go out and, let's say, deal with a rash of vandalisms or graffiti or things like that. And it's very focused, so they're able to accomplish their mission, make the arrest, and close out their case. And it is pretty simple to measure effectiveness. You've got this problem, here it is. You drop the plan, you go out and handle it, you make an arrest, problem solved, stat on the books, and you can measure the effectiveness of whether you're closing cases or not. So that's some of the good stuff. Those are the advantages of it. The disadvantages of it are interesting, to say the least. And again, you can kind of draw your own conclusion. The downside of specialization includes less flexibility, a tendency to miss the big picture, the failure to coordinate with other units, and the need for supervision. So, less flexibility means that they're very focused on one thing. So I've got to do this. This is my job. I'm on this surveillance, this and that. So I'm not as flexible to really kind of support other missions other than maybe what I have going on. A tendency to miss the big picture is because they're not focusing on the underroot or the underlying cause of crime, like a community policing type aspect, if you will. They're looking more at the issue at hand. So they want to catch the robber, they want to catch the burglar, and they're not so set on really identifying what the issues are that might be causing something. Failure to coordinate with other units it rates up there high, in a sense that sometimes we have units that are out there working and they don't coordinate with, like, let's say, the patrol watch commander. So if they need help and they get on the radio and start yelling for help, we don't even know that they were out there working because they're working undercover, if that makes any sense. So coordination with other units and communication, so we know what they're doing and maybe where they are, is really important. Then finally, the need for supervision is super important because patrol officers, by their nature, are somewhat autonomous. You go out, handle your reports, make your arrests, and there's a patrol supervisor out there, etc. But when you're working in an undercover capacity, sometimes that supervisor isn't right there, and you want to make sure that you still adhere to people's constitutional rights and you're doing the right thing. So making sure you have proper supervision and not let things slip through the crack is extremely important. So those are some of the pros and cons when it comes to dealing with those kinds of assignments. So a little bit more specific as we talk now about the investigations unit or the detective unit, really looking at the full spectrum of kind of what falls under there. To the general public, the term criminal investigation often brings to mind the detective portrayed like in novels and on the radio and in magazines and on TV. The detective or investigator single-handedly digs out all the evidence, collects tips from informants, IDs criminals, tracks them down, and brings them to justice, and there you go. While investigation is a prestigious assignment, it is important to note that an investigator with a background and experience with patrol has a distinct advantage in understanding the full spectrum of an investigation from the initial call and the submission of a case to the DA's office. So there are other pieces. This is what the text is trying to tell us, is that there are other pieces that make the detective what the detective is. So first of all would be forensic science. We have to have an understanding of forensic science. So investigation is often highly dependent on forensics. Forensic science deals with examining physical evidence to answer legal questions. Forensic experts can be found in a wide array of occupations, including forensic accountants, anthropologists, chemists, dentists, nurses, geologists, psychologists, toxicologists, and what have you. So forensic science, just to kind of dumb it down a little bit, is the study of evidence. And then there's the other piece of that is criminalistics. Criminalistics is a branch of forensic science that deals with the physical evidence related to a crime. This may include fingerprints, firearms, tool marks, blood, hair, documents, and other types of physical evidence. And often the two terms are used kind of interchangeably. So forensic science is more of a general term, a part of science answering legal questions related to examining, evaluating, and explaining physical evidence. So criminalistics is a branch of forensic science that deals with physical evidence relating to a crime like fingerprints, firearms, tool marks, and things like that. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. Now, as an investigator, we're going to kind of look at the preliminary investigation and how we handle that. So probably in between this week and next week, I'm going to post a PowerPoint on what a detective basically does. And it's coming from the Rialto Police Department, so keep in mind that it might be a little bit different somewhere else, but I'll post that and you can look at it, and it will give you kind of a walkthrough understanding of what a detective does. But throughout this chapter, when the term investigator is used, it may refer to a patrol officer performing investigative duties, a detective, or a forensic specialist. In many departments across the country, the detective is a patrol officer. They may not have a specialized person that does it because maybe there's no division. In other departments, a crime scene investigation unit is available to assist in processing the crime scene. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in the department I came from, we had a detective unit, and we also had the crime scene investigator forensic folks. So investigators do not determine the suspects to be guilty. They remain objective in their investigation, and the primary characteristic of an effective investigator is objectivity. Yes, I know their goal is to go out there and arrest people and convict them, but the primary characteristic of a good investigator is being objective and looking at the case and understanding that the investigator seeks the truth, not simply proof of a suspect's guilt, although If they can find that out during their investigation, then that's great as well. So let's kind of move into the preliminary investigation, and we'll talk a little bit about discovery crimes and involvement crimes and the difference between the two. So the preliminary investigation consists of actions performed immediately upon responding to a call or responding to a crime scene, and is usually conducted by patrol officers because they are usually the first responders. The detective isn't going to be the first responder. The actions patrol officers take as first responders can really determine the value of the crime scene evidence for investigators and prosecutors later on. In cases where the investigation is likely to be either very complex or to carry a high probability of liability or something similar, first responding officers will often just what we call secure the crime scene, set up a perimeter until detectives or an investigation team can get there and kind of take over the investigation. The importance of response time has been highly debated in this traditionally. Rapid response has been stressed, but this sometimes has been called into question. Some studies have found that arrests are seldom attributed to fast response to reported serious crimes because about 75% of all serious crimes are what we call discovery crimes, meaning crimes uncovered after they have been committed. So only about 25% are what we call involvement crimes, which are like a rapid response. So let me define those again. Discovery crime, illegal acts brought to the attention of the victim and law enforcement after the act has been committed. An example, it might be a burglary. It takes place during the middle of the night, nobody's home, people are gone. They come back the next day, they see that their house has been burglarized. They discover it later. An involvement crime would be an illegal act discovered while it's being committed, like it could be a burglary in progress, to use the same example. But a lot of times, the majority of the time, you can see that we get those crimes after they have been committed. And then we have this other word that we're going to kind of throw in here that's not on the slide, but it's important to know. It's called solvability factors. The preliminary investigation results are written into what they call a crime or an incident report containing basic facts about the crime scene, and any suspects involved. Some cases are solved during that phase. For those that are not, the decision must be made as to whether to pursue the case or to continue to work it. Usually, this decision is based on what we call solvability factors, factors affecting the probability of successfully concluding the case, such as whether there are witnesses, physical evidence, leads, with any potential credible information relevant to the investigation. So what I'm trying to say, to shorten it up, is that let's say you have a case where people get home, they find their house is burglarized, there's no fingerprints, there's no physical evidence, nobody knows who did it, there's no cameras, we interview people around the neighborhood, we can't find anything. That's a tough case to follow up on because there's really no evidence. As opposed to maybe we talk to someone in the neighborhood and they give us a description of a car with a partial plate that was seen there the night before that was suspicious and didn't belong in the neighborhood. You could work that one first. You see how that makes sense, because there are some type of solvability factors to whether maybe you could add these things up and get yourself a follow-up investigation started. So the follow-up investigation may be conducted by the detective division. Therefore, successful investigation relies on good, cooperative, coordinated efforts of detectives and patrol and the crime scene specialist to make sure that everything is done correctly at that preliminary investigation and follow-up. When you look again a little bit deeper into the investigation detective unit, there are some responsibilities, and there's a whole list of them on page 202. So we're not going to hit them all, and I'm not going to go into super detail on all of them. I'm going to leave that to you to kind of read a little bit. But part of the investigative responsibilities for patrol especially is securing the crime scene, making sure people don't go in and out. Later on, dusting or looking for fingerprints, collecting DNA evidence, interviewing people either at the crime scene or around the crime scene, trying to identify suspects. All of these things are super important to make sure that we're kind of fulfilling our investigative responsibility, if you will. So, all the facts are recorded in any particular case in a report. So we want to make sure, again, and it doesn't say here, but protecting evidence, processing evidence, again, all of these things are just really, really relevant. And I'm not going to go into every single one of these. Photographs, videotaping, measuring, sketching the crime scene. All of these things are super important when you talk about investigations. And now there are quite a few things when it talks to documenting a crime scene. We actually have 3D recreation software programs, as you can see here in this photograph, that better show what the crime scene looked like. We can put in bullet trajectories or footprints or any kind of other evidence we want. You can see here they've got casings laid out on the floor, which is great if you ever identify a suspect and you try to look at the motive and how they got in and what happened and how it happened, and you take those things to court. So all of this type of things, not only obtaining the physical evidence, but photographs, sketches, and doing these type of crime scene investigation software reconstructions are super important to making sure that we're getting everything that we need to get. So we've kind of walked through some of the things here about crime scene investigators, about collecting evidence, marking evidence, preserving evidence, and all evidence collected is marked and identified on who collected it. So we have to maintain a level of integrity in court before the case goes to trial. We must make sure that evidence is lawfully collected, seized, and documented. We have to document what we call a chain of custody, and that chain of custody is documenting who had possession of evidence from the time it was discovered and where it was taken to and booked until the present time. We talked about fingerprints, we talked about DNA a little bit, and we're going to kind of move through this rather quickly because we're going to slowly run out of time because there is a lot of stuff here. Let's see, make sure I didn't miss anything. Firearms. Another type of evidence often found at a crime scene could be a firearm. A firearm left at a crime scene may be traced to its owner through the serial number, manufacturer's ID, or the dealer. When you look at shootings and things like that, there's this term ballistics that comes out, and ballistics deals with the motion and effects of projectiles, including bullets, and it can refer to projectile characteristics inside a weapon or outside a weapon after leaving the muzzle but before impact. So ballistics is a science dealing with the motion and effects of projectiles like bullets and bombs and different things like that. We're not going to spend a lot of time as we talk about profilers and things like that, but I want to make sure that we get through some of the other small things as we before we lead up to that. So we talked about ballistics. Let me back up a minute here. We want to talk about protecting and storing evidence after evidence is collected. It's packaged, labeled, and placed in an evidence room until it's needed. If it's removed from the evidence room for any reason, checked out for any reason, there's this chain of custody that we talked about. When we process evidence in many smaller departments, an investigator or patrol officer who is trained and certified as an evidence technician will do the processing and collection. Larger departments generally have staff dedicated or technicians dedicated to do this for them. Interviewing and interrogating, a large part of any investigation is talking with people to obtain information. Investigators interview those people in order to glean more information on the case. So to interview is to question a witness or a person with information relating to an incident. And that's just kind of the basic definition of an interview. A witness is a person other than a suspect who has helpful information about a specific incident or a suspect. A witness may be a complainant, meaning the person who called the police, an accuser, a victim, an observer of an incident, an eyewitness, an expert, or a scientific examiner of physical evidence. All of these people can be a witness. An informant, which is a little bit different. Officers may also use informant. An individual who did not witness the offense but knows something about it or who committed it. There are different levels of informants, such as a credible informant and a criminal informant, both often referred to as, they call them CIs. a credible informant carries more weight than a criminal informant when using the information to gain administrative approval to get something like a search warrant or some other legal document that needs to be signed by a judge. So an informant is a person who furnishes information concerning accusations against another person or persons. And a lot of times we do use informants in order to get to the bottom of crimes and try to find out, kind of what happened. And then lastly, and then we're going to move on to profilers, but we're going to talk on kind of IDing suspects and the three basic types of ID. So when we talk about identifying suspects, if officers do not witness a crime, eyewitness identification plays a real important part in the arrest as well as the trial proceedings. Very specific questions and use of an identification diagram may aid witnesses in identifying suspects. Other information related to the suspect is also obtained. For example, how the suspect left the scene. Was he running, walking, or driving in a car? What direction? Occasionally a lead is called in or otherwise provided to the police to implicate a specific subject as the suspect in a crime. Now, there are three basic types of IDs, and we'll do these kind of quickly. So the first is a field identification, the next is a photographic identification, and the last one is what they call a lineup. So each type of identification is used in specific circumstances, and each must meet certain legal requirements to be admissible in court. As the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause protects suspects from suggestive identification procedures. So again, we have to make sure that we're doing this correctly. The Supreme Court held 5 factors to be considered in determining a witness's reliability. The first was the opportunity of the witness to view the defendant during the crime. Number 2, the witness level of attention. Number 3, the accuracy of any descriptions of the defendant before the identification. Number 4, the witness's level of certainty. And number 5, the time between the crime and the confrontation. So let's back up now and let's define field ID. Field identification is at the scene identification made within a short time after a crime has been committed. Generally, the suspect is returned to the crime scene for the possible identification, or the witness may be taken to where the suspect is being held. Although, usually what we used to do is we would bring the witness to the suspect. Field identification is used when the suspect matches the description given by a witness and is apprehended close to the crime scene. The critical element in the field ID is time. So field ID, at the scene identification made with a reasonable time frame after a crime has been committed. Field identification is based on the totality of the circumstances, considering the witness's concentration on the suspect when the crime was committed, the accuracy of description, the certainty of the time of the confrontation and the length of time between the crime's commission, and the field ID. Now, a photo lineup or a photographic identification is another option. Most people are familiar with the procedure, having victims and witnesses go through, say, mugshot books in hopes of finding a picture of a person that they saw on commit a particular crime. This type of ID is time consuming and is really profitable only if the suspect has a record, because otherwise you won't have a photograph. So that's kind of one thing to kind of just understand. And we'll talk about how to do these lineups later on. A third option is basically what they call a lineup, allowing witnesses to observe several individuals, one of whom is the suspect, to see if the witnesses can ID the suspect. Suspect may be asked to speak, walk, turn, assume a stance, or make a gesture. If for any reason the suspect refuses to cooperate in a lineup, photographic identification may be used. The suspect's refusal to participate may be used against him later on in court. And these are kind of the three things that we wanted to talk about. So now we're going to move on quickly because we're coming up on 30 minutes to profilers. And since the first police investigation, detectives have focused on relatively superficial characteristics to identify suspects like height, weight, race, gender, age, accent, type of car, MO, and so on. Although these descriptors remain valid and are still considered when searching for suspects, profilers have begun delivering deeper insight into suspects' personalities, their psyches, that basically result or kind of show you behaviors that develop and kind of paint a portrait of serial criminals. So profiling evolved as a discipline during the 1970s with the FBI's increasing understanding of serial murderers. Drug courier profiling emerged as part of the war on drugs in 1980, began in the airports, and actually was upheld as constitutional in a court case called United States versus Sokolow, and it's SOKOLOW, 1989. Profiling can be reactive or proactive. In reactive profiling, investigators attempt to solve crimes that have already occurred, which kind of makes sense. And proactive profiling, in contrast, attempts to interdict and basically stop crime before it happens. Psychics are a little bit different. In addition to profiling, some departments have turned to the use of psychics, a very highly controversial practice. The use of psychics in investigations has also been popularized by the media, including some of different TV programs. And to be quite honest with you, in Rialto, we never use psychics that I can think of. But I'm sure that they have their use somewhere in there, but we really never kind of used them. And that's kind of the lowdown on psychics. So we kind of talked about this one right here. Popularized by the media, results are kind of debatable. A lot of investigators don't place a lot of faith in psychics, and other investigators have found them to be kind of helpful. Intel officers or intelligence officers, most large departments have intelligence divisions whose top officers report directly to the chief and whose activities are kept from the rest of the department. Intelligence kind of works in two different areas. Intelligence officers may be undercover officers investigating crime, or internal affairs officers investigating complaints against police officers within the department. So, these undercover officers rely on anonymity, meaning that nobody really knows who they are. They can use assumed names. Their job is to kind of blend in. And, there's a myth out there that says, well, police officers working undercover have to ID themselves as police officers. That's a lie, and it's kind of a myth. They don't, and the reason they don't is because it could jeopardize their safety. So, and that just kind of makes sense. So, internal affairs is a group of intelligence officers, and their job is to investigate wrongdoing of other officers. And it is quite an unenviable task, because a lot of people don't want to investigate their own, but it really is something that we need to do. So that's something that we rely on to make sure that we are doing the right things in law enforcement and in our police department. So quickly, as we talk about juvenile officers, another area of specialization, yet another specialized assignment is that of the juvenile police officer. Police officers are often the first contact with youths in legal trouble. Therefore, it is justifiable and logical to have juvenile police specialists, because most juveniles' work is informal and officer discretion plays a critical role, such as determining whether to release, refer, or detain juvenile officers must be chosen from the most qualified officers in the department. And basically, it's a special assignment. And, part of these juvenile officers might be to investigate reports of neglected or abused kids. They could be assigned to what we call school resource officers, where we have officers that are armed on campuses to deal with campus crime or any active shooter situation or something like that. And then the last bullet point on here, crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED, doesn't have anything to do with juveniles, but it does have to do with basically making sure that the location, the business, your home, or whatever is free of those obstructions that allow people to commit crime. So an example could be if you've ever driven by a liquor store and you see a million signs in the windows and you can't see into the windows, all you can see is the signs. Well, CPTED, or that crime prevention through environmental design, would tell you, hey, don't have so many signs in the windows because the officers driving by would like to be able to look through the glass and see the clerk standing behind the register to know that everything's okay. So that's kind of that concept right there. Quickly, as we move through, vice officers deal with a lot of things. They usually concentrate on illegal gambling, even legal gambling, prostitution, pornography. Not really narcotics to a certain degree, but maybe a little bit. Most places have their own division, their own narcotics unit, and liquor violations. So those really prostitution, pornography, internet crimes, a lot of them might fall under the vice officer's scope. Talked about narcotics officers. They would handle obviously all the narcotics issues happening in town. Same with gang officers. On a broader scope, we have SWAT officers. Began in 1967. Their job was to deal with critical incidents. They are immediately available. Actually, they like you to be available within 60 minutes or so for response time. Their schedules need to be very flexible. They're trained to do a lot of different things. They handle all of those dangerous situations that the average patrol officers don't have the training or resources to handle, and their job is to contain and, unfortunately, at the end of the day, to neutralize. SWAT teams began back in 1967, like I started off saying, when LAPD organized such a unit to respond to critical incidents. The concept of a police tactical unit inspired by military special forces unit makes some people kind of uncomfortable, but I think if you look at nowadays on all the issues that are happening around the globe, specifically active shooter and things like that, you can certainly appreciate the need for SWAT teams that are highly trained and can go out there and handle all these situations. Next, again, pretty quick will be canine units. Very, very good for things like search and rescue, apprehension of suspects, drug and explosive detection. So they have dogs that sniff and they can sniff out drugs and explosives. Same with cadaver dogs, or cadaver detection, meaning that at large mass scenes of earthquakes or similar events, they can basically smell cadavers or people under the rubble. They are very good when it comes to dealing with crime deterrence, and they are a force multiplier, meaning that a canine officer and their partner, their dog, can search a building in 2 or 3 times faster than 2 or 3 officers can, because the dog can basically go through the building and sniff and save a lot of time and a lot of manpower, where a regular officer would have to walk through that whole thing and try to find somebody. So a lot of benefits when it comes to canine officers. And then finally, we'll kind of end up with reserve officers. We don't have as many reserve officers as we used to, but they are, because now the qualifications to be a reserve are somewhat similar to be a regular. So most people would rather just get into law enforcement and be a regular. But there are some people that have great jobs doing what they love, and they just want to serve and protect their communities, and they do that through reserve. You can go on the Peace Officer Standards and Training, the Post website, and it'll give you more information on how to be a reserve and what the qualifications are. But they are an auxiliary force, if you will, additional uniformed personnel. They can help in all types of educational programs. They supplement staffing when it comes to working with other officers. So what could be a 1-officer car, if you put a reserve in there, now it's a 2-officer car, and they can handle things that a 1-officer car couldn't. They definitely contribute to Homeland Security efforts by adding security at certain events and things like that, and they extend the resources of law enforcement agencies. So they are super helpful when it comes to adding people onto your force to helping in certain situations. But again, a lot of people would rather just go ahead and go regular than just kind of be a reserve officer. So I know that was pretty quick, and we'll talk about a few more things later on that were in this chapter that maybe we didn't get to, but make sure that you go through the textbook and fill in the blanks that I didn't hit, and go through the definitions as well, so you have a better understanding as we start to move into some of the other chapters. So this will be the conclusion of chapter 6, And we're right about at our 40-minute mark. And with that being said, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them on the general discussion board. And other than that, I will talk to you all next week.